Helen Chandler became a star at the end of the silent era and seemed to effortlessly transition to starring in the talkies. But by the mid-30s, she had retired. Why? Join me as I investigate. Conflicting sources report Helen Chandler being born in either 1906 or 1908 in either New York City or Charleston, South Carolina, to Leland and Frances Chandler. Sources have confirmed that her younger brother, Leland Jr., was born in Charleston, so the family was there for a time before moving to New York. Apparently, her mother pushed Helen and Leland into a stage career at a young age, and at the age of 10 or 12, Helen made her Broadway debut in Penrod in 1918, which starred Helen Hayes and Andrew Lawler. 2 years later, she supported John Barrymore in his production of Richard III. Later that year, she appeared on the stage with Leland and Daddy Dumplins, which starred Macklin Arbuckle. In 1922, she supported Lionel Barrymore in his production of Macbeth. Several more Broadway credits followed for the rest of the 1920s, including her playing Ophelia to Basil Sidney's Hamlet in 1925, and starring with Gregory Gall in Faust in 1928. In 1927, Helen made her silent film debut in The Music Master, which starred Alec B. Francis and Lois Moran, and soon supported Olive Borden in The Joy Girl that same year. Sadly, both of these films are lost. One source indicates that Helen did not really enjoy making silent films and returned to Broadway. In addition to Faust, she also starred in The Marriage Bed in 1929. With the talkies becoming more popular, Helen returned to Hollywood later that year. First, she supported Beryl Mercer and Morton Downey in the musical drama Mother's Boy, before starring in her first talkie that same year, Salute, in which she played a young singer courted by brothers George O'Brien and William Janney and got to showcase her lovely singing voice. Quick side note, I could not find the role, but Helen apparently also replaced one of the stars of Showboat during its original Broadway run in the late 1920s. Helen received great notice from Variety for her performance in Salute. In 1930, Helen starred with Leslie Howard, Douglas Fairbanks Jr., and Beryl Mercer in Outward Bound, a spooky tale of a group of ship passengers that cannot recall how they boarded the ship or what their destination is. The New York Times raved about Helen's performance, but it apparently was not a commercial hit. Later in 1930, Helen starred alongside Dorothy Peterson, David Manners, and Edward Woods in Mother's Cry, as a sister of a criminal that cannot endure any more of her mother's coddling of them. The New York Times gave Helen a good review again, but the film appears to have not done well commercially. In 1931, Helen starred in her most often remembered role, that of heroine Mina in the first official film adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was produced by Universal and directed by Todd Browning. Much has been written about this production, its cast, and in particular, Helen's participation in it. Multiple sources indicate that Todd Browning had seen Helen on Broadway in 1928's Silent House and remembered her so fondly that he knew he had to have her to play Mina. Helen, being the most famous and well-known member of the cast at that time, was hired and apparently paid the largest salary, even higher than that of titular star Bela Lugosi, who had to fight hard to be cast despite the fact that he played the Count on Broadway and was still touring in productions of the play. Evidently, Helen didn't initially want to be a part of the film. She once told an interviewer that she didn't want to be typecast as the girl bewitched by Dracula. Nevertheless, she delivered a brilliant performance. I first saw this movie over 20 years ago, and I've never forgotten the scene in which she is under Dracula's spell and compelled against her will to attack Harker. The New York Times agreed and praised Helen's performance. Helen made 5 more films in 1931. First, she starred with Ramon Navarro in Daybreak as a young music teacher smitten with an army officer, and gave what the New York Times said was far and away the best she has given in motion pictures. The best performance, that is. Next, she played the title character in Salvation Now, a screen adaptation of an older play that co-starred Ralph Graves. Next, she starred as the woman that comes between World War I veteran friends Richard Barthelmess, David Manners, Johnny Mac Brown, and Elliot Nugent in The Last Flight, which saw a star that I covered just a few months back, Walter Byron, really play against type wonderfully as a nasty villain. But Helen was also delightful. Variety praised her performance and asked her to take a bow for her work. Next, she made her first talkie comedy, the sadly lost Fanny Foley Herself, which co-starred Edna May Oliver. And finally, in 1931, she starred as a mail-order bride that comes between a father and son, played by Walter Houston and Douglas Montgomery, respectively, in A House Divided, in which she gave a fascinating, emotional performance. If she wasn't busy enough that year, Helen also returned to Broadway at the end of 1931 to star with Leslie Banks in Springtime for Henry, which ran for 199 performances into 1932. As a result, Helen was off the screen for almost a year before she returned at the end of 1932 to star in Vanity Street at Columbia and gave a powerful performance as Jenny, a down-on-her-luck girl that is given a new chance at life by gruff policeman Charles Bickford. The New York Times stated that Helen pretty much made the film memorable. In 1933, after supporting Katharine Hepburn and Christopher Strong, Helen starred with Leon Ames, then known as Leon Wyckoff, in Alimony Madness, a Poverty Row film about a woman whose happiness with her husband is threatened by his demanding ex-wife. Helen naturally gave another powerhouse performance rich with emotion. Also in 1933, Helen starred with Joan Blondell, Warren William, Genevieve Tobin, Ruth Donnelly, and Wallace Ford in the Warner Brothers comedy Goodbye Again, a delightful film that saw Helen give another great comedic performance. In 1934, Helen starred in Midnight Alibi with Richard Barthelmess, Anne Vorschach, and Helen Lowell, and gave my favorite performance of hers. In an adaptation of a Damon Runyon story, she played the younger version of Helen Lowell's character, introduced to viewers in a lovely series of flashbacks. Helen finished out 1934 starring in another comedy, Radio Parade in 1935, in which she gave a hilarious performance as a secretary that causes mischief at a radio station run by Clifford Mollison. In the middle of her 1934 film work, Helen also starred on Broadway in These Two, which sadly only lasted 8 performances. In 1935, I'm a little unsure of the timeline here, she filmed It's a Bet at Elstree Studios in England and also returned to Broadway full-time for the next 2 years. She starred in the sadly short-lived comedy It's You I Want and the Dominant Sex before having another hit as Jane Bennet in Pride and Prejudice, which ran for over 200 performances. She then had another successful run as a title character in Lady Precious Dream before starring in The Homes of Baker Street, which ran into 1937. In early 1938, Helen appeared in her final film, the Stuart Irwin comedy Mr. Boggs Steps Out, as the humorously named Oleander Tubbs, a brilliant businesswoman that helps suddenly rich Boggs, played by Irwin, take control of a barrel factory. It was another lovely comedic performance, and Helen and Stuart Irwin really played very well off one another. Following this film, Helen left Hollywood for good and returned to Broadway for one final year. After briefly starring in The Man from Cairo, Helen had another hit, recreating her role from the film version of Outward Bound for a stage revival, which ran for 255 performances and co-starred Vincent Price. Sadly, the rest of Helen's life was a real tragedy. I don't want to go too much into her personal business here, but she unfortunately had 3 failed marriages and a lifetime of unhappiness that sadly began in her childhood with a troubled relationship with her domineering stage mother. While her brother was able to break away from their mother and make his own life, Helen stuck with the only life she had ever known, acting, and never really got the chance to grow up normally like other children. While Helen had many stage and screen successes, many sources have indicated that she battled loneliness, despair, and depression, which sadly led to a dependence on alcohol that unfortunately negatively affected her career during the 30s, since she so often had to seek treatment. She eventually moved in with her brother Leland and his wife Geraldine and found great joy in caring for their nephew, also named Leland. Eventually, Leland and Geraldine moved Helen into her own apartment before she had to be committed to an asylum after an incident where she was severely burned after falling asleep with a cigarette in the early 1950s. But she eventually was able to get out of the asylum and live her final years in a better environment, a boarding house supported by the Motion Picture Relief Fund. Despite many attempts to fiercely fight her crippling disease, Helen sadly eventually succumbed to an ulcer brought on by her alcoholism in 1965. She was just 59 years old. Per her wishes, Helen was cremated. She was interred in a private vault in Chapel of the Pines in Hollywood, which this vault began as a place to house the remains of those individuals that were not claimed by family to be interred or scattered elsewhere, or were placed there due to financial constraints or other difficulties. In 2006, Chapel of the Pines' new owners put an end to this option. I highly recommend checking out Hollywood Graveyard's fascinating video on YouTube on the Chapel of the Pines vault for more information. In 2022, Hollywood Graveyard creator Arthur Dark and Silence's Platinum creator Jessica Wall led an amazing effort to assist Chapel of the Pines with cataloging all of the some 10,000 individuals in the 5 private vaults there, including several notable actors: Florence Turner, Alma Bennett, William Desmond, H.B. Warner, Oscar winner Edmund Gwenn, and Helen Chandler. Thanks to Arthur and Jessica's further efforts, with the permission of Helen's relatives, Helen was interred in a beautiful final resting place at the Hollywood Forever Cemetery Cathedral Mausoleum that is now accessible so that her fans from all over the world can pay tribute to this incredible artist. While Helen's personal life ended in tragedy, we are fortunate to have the majority of her talkies available to view that showcase just what an amazing actor she was. While her work in Dracula is an essential view, I highly recommend Midnight Alibi, Alimony Madness, A House Divided, and Goodbye Again. Thank you, Helen Chandler, for being such a truly captivating, incredible actor. You are missed. Please like and subscribe or follow this account if you want to learn more about the history of silent film stars whose stardom lasted only briefly in the talkies. Please also follow or subscribe to Silence is Platinum and Hollywood Graveyards. Their content is amazing, and I must thank Arthur and Jessica for their beautiful generosity and their work at the Chapel of the Pines Vault. Up next, join me as I cover the silent to talkie career of Anne Christie. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a great weekend.